The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to a new episode of Through the Glass Columns, your weekly read-along Wheel of Time podcast. If there's an extra pep in my voice, it's because somewhere out in the world, you all are actually listening to us as we record this. So rather than being two nerds talking into microphones alone in our basement or spare room, we now really feel like this is something we're talking to all of you about. So thank you for joining in and for following with us and tweeting at us and communicating with us. Keep it up. We want to hear it. I know you won't now hear this for like a month, but that's okay. I hope you've been communicating. So I will not blather on anymore before I introduce my guide through the Wheel of Time, our expert on this podcast, Mr. Tylor. Tylor, how are you today?
I'm doing very well. Thank you, Greg. And you're exactly right. I'm super thrilled that this is out in the world. And I'll be honest, when we launched this, I was basically planning on having a conversation with you that we recorded and then no one listened to it. So the fact that people are listening is very exciting. And we're just glad you're along on this journey with us, because that's really what the Wheel of Time is. You got to put in a little time. And I'm glad some of you are at least starting off with us and hopefully enjoying the ride. So today we're going to be covering two more chapters. That's chapter 14, The Stag and Lion, and also chapter 15, Strangers and Friends. But before we get there, we do have a little bit of ill-advised discussion of visual media on a non-visual podcast, or however you phrased that. That's close enough for me.
Like I remember. Go ahead.
And today we are going to be talking about one of the chapter icons. And this is going to kind of be the standard for us until we run out of chapter icons for, a good chunk of the rest of this book. And today we're going to be talking about the icon that appears at the beginning of chapter 14, The Stag and the Lion. And this is actually the only chapter icon that we have referenced so far on the show, the Dragon's Fang. And so I wanted to just kind of give Greg an opportunity, since you've just joined the world. What do you think when you see this at the beginning of a chapter? Does it tell you anything? And then we can talk a little bit about kind of the in-world and out-of-world symbolism of what this symbol means.
Yeah, so as I recall, the Dragon's Fang was marked on a lot of the houses in Two Rivers when the attack of the Trollocs happened, and there was kind of questions lingering about who had made that mark and who was signaling what with that mark. I will say that is kind of my second thought when I look at it. My first thought is when I initially made the social media accounts for our podcast, you can't join Twitter without a image, an icon for your picture, or maybe it's Instagram. It's probably Instagram because Twitter has the eggs. Yeah. So I just Googled Wheel of Time thing, and up came this. So I first branded us with the Dragon's Fang, which I'm now deeply regretful of, that we marked ourselves as kind of dark ones for the initial take. But that out of universe aside, I think it very much is what it promises. It kind of looks more claw to me than fang. If it's a fang, it looks more to me like a snake fang, right? Something with venom in it. It's got more of that shape than kind of what I think of as like a canine or feline fang to it, and that makes sense. If we're imagining a dragon fang, it would be more snake-like, more reptilian. Totally logical to me. But I like that we maintain the black and white duality, and that it's simple. It is, I assume not, but looks like it could be like a woodcut, and I assume a lot of crafty people on Etsy have done wood block cuts of these and make prints of them and so on. So yes. And was that all I was charged with?
Yeah. I
Okay.
think that definitely works. So the two things that I kind of wanted to mention about this, well, first, before anything else, I just need to preface the fact that I am in love with the chapter icons for this series. I think they just work as a way of kind of highlighting what's going to be coming in each chapter, giving you just a little bit of a feel for the tone and what's coming up. And I love them so much that actually my right arm is dedicated to 4 of the chapter icons. I have a Wheel of Time tattoo. I absolutely love it. I'm planning on getting a second one.
Save it when we launch our OnlyFans. Don't reveal it all. We'll have branded content then too.
I actually can't reveal it all. I have been unable to talk about my tattoo for quite some time since the TV show came out because it does actually contain minor spoilers if I explain it. That being said, the Dragon Fang is not one of the icons that is on my arm, so I can discuss it freely. And this actually reminded me of something that was actually on the episode of the podcast that aired today. I listened to it. Some timey-wimey things. We're talking about episode 3 of the podcast. And in that episode, you mentioned when you were reading Game of Thrones, well, you would finish a chapter, say, about Arya, and you would like flip forward to see when the next chapter about Arya was going to be, or, you know, whatever character it was that you were interested in seeing next. That is to some degree the same function that these icons serve in this series. There are some icons that are kind of dedicated to specific characters. There are some that are dedicated to themes or, you know, groups, things that might show up. The Dragon's Fang, generally speaking, is going to show us one of two things. Either we're going to have a chapter that is kind of focused on the dark or on, you know, evil goings on. That's kind of the indication that we get from people putting the Dragon's Fangs on doors and more or less accusing them of being evil. The other thing that we've noticed is I think the other time that we've seen this icon show up before, it's always been in reference to someone telling a story about a false dragon, right? So this makes a reasonable amount of sense. I think the first time we saw this chapter icon was in the chapter The Peddler, which I don't think is an indication that there's something evil going on in that chapter, but rather it's because the peddler shows up and immediately starts telling a story about the false dragon in Galen. And so this is kind of our first indication that each of these symbols maybe is keying us into what's coming next. And this is actually something that I'll occasionally do. You talked about for the Game of Thrones, seeing when does that character show up next. Some of these icons have specific enough connotations that I'll just go, okay, when's the next time that one pops up? And it won't give me the exact time the character will be back, but it at least gives me something to go on. This one's a little bit less specific than that, right? It's just some things are going to happen that are evil or something. But I think it's really cool. And the thing that I like about this image most is the fact that, like you said, it's the light dark duality. And I like the idea that it seems like it is a kind of a white object, right? It's a tooth or a fang, and then there's almost this dark shading or shadow lying over it. And I think that's a really interesting indication for what we know about the dragon or false dragons at this point, right? We know the dragon Lews Therin went mad and killed his family. We know that male channelers, including false dragons, always go mad and die. And so this image representing dragons and false dragons as something that could theoretically be kind of light, but is covered in this shadow, I think is really evocative of the kind of things that we're starting to dig into a little bit in the mythology of this series. That's kind of all I had to say, Greg. Was there anything in that you kind of keyed off of, or, you know, it made you think specifically about this image?
Yeah, I think what you just said makes a lot of sense to me. And we have strength, but this undercutting darkness. And that, you know, it's literally the shadow as it's drawn, or it appears to be the shadow. And then again, thinking of this more as like a snake fang, to me, that's also the venom, right? The poison, you know, while you can have the power and the strength, you are going to succumb to it eventually. And that's going to affect whoever's wielding it. So yeah, a lot in a small, simple image. You know, because those were just brilliant things I had said about Game of Thrones, and I'm so impressed with myself. But you know, Game of Thrones is also has a symbol for every house, and certainly when the TV show took off, this became like the opportunity of a lifetime for HBO to market all of them, and you could get a T-shirt with each of them and a keychain with each of them, and so on. So it's interesting to me that that is so much based in kind of heraldry, and this is not. This is, like you're saying, more thematic, kind of hints towards it, at least in this particular context. I understand there may be others that change that, but yeah. And, certainly when I've been putting different things together for the podcast and doing my half-assed photoshopping, there are a lot of these symbols that come up when you just search Wheel of Time and symbols or circles and so on. And, they're often without context when I'm looking at them there, but I've certainly noted what a variety there is. So excited for more to come. So let's transition back to the novel itself. So we joked last time that we should have called the show the Stag and Lion. Of course, it's a pub name, a tavern name. So I'm going to pass it off to you to do our summary, especially because it involves a dream, which you know how I feel about dreams. So go ahead.
You're going to have to get over that dream thing with this series. I'm sorry, buddy. So the characters arrive in the village of Berlon. They get to this inn, the Stag and Lion. And initially we see a scene where Moraine is interacting with the innkeeper, and we kind of get to see what's on her mind. She asks about the White Cloak. She asks about the goings on in the area, any oddities or strange things happening. And then, as every good story does, we get bath time. And I think this is a really great scene from my perspective because we get to see Matt both at kind of his most thoughtless, kind of starting to spill the beans about the Trollocs and what's going on in the two rivers. And then we also see kind of the dynamic interaction between Tom and Matt and Rand and Perrin all kind of bouncing off of each other and trying to cover the story. Lan is unhappy despite how well they have covered themselves. He is very upset at them talking about this and more or less threatens them to never mention Trollocs in front of people ever again. After these baths, they emerge and we briefly see a young woman with cropped hair looking at all of them, who then immediately walks down the hallway. We'll talk more about her in the next chapter. However, after that, everyone goes to sleep, and Rand has a dream where he is confronted with someone who is names himself Baal-Zaman. He essentially says that Rand is a pawn of the Aes Sedai, and they've been setting up him and many others, and gives a long string of examples of horrible things that have happened to other people, and lists a number of names, which we get at least some significance of that again in the next chapter. And then finally, we see this individual. He tries to get Rand to drink some sort of wine or drink. Rand resists. And then finally, he breaks a rat's back in the dream. And that will obviously become much more important in the following chapter when we see that rats have actually died with their backs broken in the inn. So that slightly jumps ahead a little bit, but that's generally what we're looking at, is a little information gathering, a lot of bath time, and I think pretty interesting and evocative dream sequence. So given those three things and knowing your hatred for dreams, what did you pull out of probably the first 2/3 of the chapter?
Yeah, so it felt very much to me like the parts in our D&D games that are boring to me, right? And and that's not a commentary on your dungeon mastering, but so much as, I think every D&D group has their dynamics, and our group is not particularly strong at like, you arrive in a town, what are you doing? We kind of just hem and haw for a while, and then eventually you put in some kind of rail that's like, maybe that guy who whispered about a tavern should be followed or whatever. And we figure it out. So this felt like that phase of an adventure. It's like, okay, we got where we were going. And now before this can continue, we have to learn more about it and we have to pull through it. So yeah, I have a lot of more specific reactions to different pieces of it. But I would say that was kind of my general feeling here as we met some of this new area and some of this new town. Maybe one of the first things that is sitting here in my notes is just the simple phrase, this city seems to be a powder keg, right? That this is ready to blow. It is the pressure from the White Cloaks, which we had hinted at last time, and now we hear that the kind of higher level of dark tidings and wolves and crops, all of that has pushed the people from the mines in the mountains into the city. So you have the townspeople who generally dislike the miners, broadly speaking, and they're all mixing together. Then you're having the added tension of the White Cloaks poking around and trying to not cause trouble while causing trouble. And that might misread them a little, but at the same time, they're keeping a low profile so they don't get kicked out, but they are also really trying to poke around and figure out how many Aes Sedai have been through there or are there currently. So all of that to me is exciting, and only purely from the like, I'm reading this and bad things should happen so that I have fun things to read about. I mean, obviously I don't wish these characters harm, but like, it's exciting to think like, oh, I don't think we're going to leave this city just like ho hum on we go. I think something's going to blow.
Yeah, and I think the thing that really excited me in that section of this chapter is you're exactly right. We set up this, powder keg, all of the things are going on. There's the political situation between the mayor and the White Cloaks, all of the stuff that you talked about. And then Moraine shows up and Master Fitch is like, don't worry, this powder keg, it's not going to explode. There's no Aes Sedai in the city. And that's just an excellent piece of little dramatic irony that we get of Moraine knowing, okay, I'm the fuse that could set this powder keg off. And so I think that dynamic of this is a city that was poised to explode, and now we're adding just a little bit of fuel to that fire, I think it's a really exciting place to start kind of a new section of the book, right? We're finally out of the two rivers for the first time, and to now see, okay, the world is actually scarier out there rather than more safe like we expected, I think is really interesting, and is a little pull the rug out from under you moment that I think Jordan pulls off really well.
Yeah, and then to feed into the next chunk of there, that obviously is what's motivating this tension between Matt and Lan, and this kind of concern. My mind naturally went to the Hobbits again, right?
Yeah.
There's the great scene in the Fellowship of the Ring movie where they get to the inn and Pippin's like, oh, Frodo, yeah, here he is back here, and points out Frodo, and that's when I think Frodo puts on the ring for the first time.
Yeah.
And so it felt very much like that. So I was saying "fool of a took" under my breath, even though you would think Matt would be Merry and Perrin would be Pippin, but it's funny even just saying that out loud how you hear the names kind of mingle together in some ways. So my mind went to him, and presenting him as a total rube in this moment, I think again helps signal mostly to the audience like the stakes have changed and this world has changed. And so whereas this might have been endearing and such, and actually there's more on that in the next chapter certainly, what was kind of cute and quaint is now actually at risk of great harm, not just to the party of characters we love, but to the wider townspeople who are all already suffering. Anything you want to say about Matt and his being a rube?
Yeah, I mean, I just think I'm just happy that we get a little bit of Matt in this chapter and the next chapter. One of my, kind of complaints about the early sections of The Eye of the World is that it is so Rand centric in a lot of ways that some of the characters who I really grow to love later on in the series, Matt, Perrin, Egwene, even Moraine and Lan to some degree, we're reading a lot about them, but we're never in their heads. And in a lot of cases, Rand isn't paying attention to them, right? They're probably having conversations and doing things that we're just not seeing because we're only getting one kind of look at how things are happening. And so to me, I really love this scene just because we get an opportunity to see Matt out of his element and see kind of him struggling to figure out, how do I keep being this like funny, boisterous, talk about everything, make friends with everyone guy while also keeping a really important secret? Because I don't think Matt has ever kept any secret at this point in his life, much less a really important one.
Yeah, and you joked about a good bath scene, but the metaphor is all written in that, right? Because they've peeled off their outer layers, they've set down their weapons, and we hear references to both of those things, and they're being a little bit more of themselves. I'll stick to figuratively, although also literally exposing themselves to each other and thinking about, how much of myself do I share? And just like you said, how do I still be myself in this new context and in this new situation. So yeah, it's a good character building moment, certainly. And a bit of fun is had at the like just laying in the bath and moaning essentially,
Yeah.
like just feeling a good bath. I'm not a bath guy, but I was like, maybe I should like enjoy a good soak at some point.
Yeah, I'm
um
not a bath guy, but I'm a sauna guy, and I can relate hard
there
to
it
that
is.
scene.
Yeah, I can't do the sauna at my gym because it's a YMCA and the average age is like 75.
Yeah,
I'm
that's
like,
fair.
I don't want to see my future in this way. I can't do it. I can't do it. Um, so I did want to, you're our editor, so I'm gonna say drop in a bell sound effect. Ding, 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 ding. That'll count.
Yeah.
One of my predictions came true because I just re-listened when you dropped the trailer episode, and one of the predictions I mentioned was I expected food. Food was going to come in, and
Yeah.
we do have a reference to food: chickens, turnips, and hen peas. So give me half credit because I think I said delicious food, and that does not sound delicious and is presented as like this is all we got because times are tough. But there it is. Food has arrived.
I was actually wondering if you were going to bring this up, but my full notes on that scene are food, 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 food. So I don't have much to add.
But it's there and that counts. So, we haven't put in the like the prices right, like bump, bump, boom. So we can at least give me a ding when it happens. So I'll transition from there to something real, which is just across that scene. The main vibe I took away is everything is more dangerous now. Even before we get to the dream and the kind of dark one imagery and all that, everything is dangerous now. Everything is more on an edge, and so they're gonna have to step it up. They're gonna have to really mature quickly because otherwise, this fellowship is doomed.
Yeah, and I really liked there was one phrase that kind of got thrown in there that I think worked really well to emphasize this, which is there's a moment once Lan comes in and he kind of chastises Matt and tells him, don't be talking to anyone. And Rand is kind of like, well, who do we trust, right? If this is just a random bath attendant, how do we know he's a bad person? It seems like someone who we could just talk to. And the response that Lan gives is something along the lines of, I trust no one until we reach Tar Valon and only half once we arrive there. And Rand kind of like laughs at that, and Lan just gives him a look like, no, I don't trust a single human until we get to Tar Valon. And that seems to be the moment as I'm reading where it feels like Rand kind of gets that sunk in a little bit more than it had before. He's like, oh, it's not just we shouldn't be talking about this. It's anyone, including the bath attendant, could be the evil person who turns us in, kind of thing.
Yeah, and again, I'm thinking of Tolkien and how there's a large section there, and Frodo says something cool like, I suspect we can trust Aragorn because anybody who we shouldn't trust would seem fair but be fouler, or something like that. And I think there's that kind of play going on here. It's like the innocuous can be dangerous, and the ones who automatically feel like danger are perhaps more of our allies. And to skip to the end of this chapter, that continues to be a troubling bit of reaction to Moraine, right? That they're still suspicious of Aes Sedai. They've been warned that they are always acting on their own agenda, for lack of a better term. So I think that question of can we still trust even these people is valid. And while Lan may want to keep them safe, he's not going to hesitate to sacrifice them. So I think they're right to be a little skeptical of him.
Yeah, and I think this is a really interesting change for the Two Rivers folks, right? Because I think all of them pretty much bought into the mayor says these people saved town, the blacksmith seemed to stand up for them, and most interestingly, Tam basically said, look, you can't trust them completely, but if they tell you something, you should believe it. And so I think for a long time, pretty much up until this point in or probably the previous chapter or two in the series, it's basically these guys have been, yes, Moraine and Lan are good people. Everyone, our parents have told us they're good. We're going to follow them. And then it's not until the last chapter or two when Moraine basically tells them, look, you can either keep going with me or I'll kill you. that now, especially Matt, but all of them seem to be much more skeptical of these two people who prior they had kind of taken at their word as far as whether they were good or bad people. And so I think that shift we see really dramatically in these two chapters, where we see, Matt and Rand and Perrin really worrying about not only what information can they share with the wide world, but also what information can they share with Moiraine and Lan. And that shift in dynamic, I think, is really indicative of how these books kind of work, right? Who is talking to who at any given time is very important in a lot of cases.
Yeah, and it's become a joke in a lot of fandom circles. It's like, where could two people having a conversation just end the plot on so many of these types of things? And this was clearly one of those moments for me, again, thinking of the end of the chapter where he's like, I don't think I'll tell her. I'm like, just tell her. Like, one of those moments where we could just end a lot of the tension and push forward. But, again, I don't tend to fault creators for those choices because they're being natural to characters. Yeah. There are many examples from the lives of myself, you, everybody we love, where if they'd had a conversation instead of not, then a whole bunch of plot would have been skipped, for lack of a better term. So I think that, again, we have to remember he's writing about, older teenagers, and they're not going to act logically all the time. And that's not convenient plotting or anything like that. It's just writing who these characters are, and maybe it helps a little in the plotting.
And I think one of the things that Robert Jordan does really well is he gives his characters very believable motivations for not telling each other things, right? I think you're exactly right. This is one of those moments where that meme would be like, hey, Moiraine, I had a bad dream, end credits, right? That's kind of how this would look a little bit, but she threatened to kill him in the previous chapter. It's very logical that he would be a little bit concerned about, sharing all of this information with her. That being said, I think we want to make sure that we spend a little bit of time on the unconscious part of this chapter. So given that I kind of have all of the, background of what's going on here, and this is intended to be a relatively mysterious kind of building the tension sort of dream, I want your take on Rand's dream before I even highlight anything, just to see what someone who doesn't know all of the backstory was able to pick up on.
Sure. And, again, to lift the veil a little bit, I will be the first to admit we read this like 3 or 4 days ago, and then Tylor had a stomach bug, so we delayed. So I'm going to do my absolute best, but there might be details I've already forgotten. So this may be a lot of my note reading. So, okay. So we get a dream very similar to the previous dream, in which we have hallways and doorways and balconies and tunnels, and there's some description of that architecture. I kind of zoned out on that part. I'm like, yep, I get it. It's a dreamscape. So then we get the appearance of the Dark One, and the Dark One identifies himself as Baalzamon.
I think that's how it's pronounced. Yeah.
Okay. And the interaction between the two of them is very much at the heart of this dream, and it seems like it's open communication. Again, to continue the Tolkien theme tonight, it felt like a Palantir type conversation, like these two are actually talking to each other. And so he speaks of a lot of things that feel portentous. The first one in my note is he spends some time speaking of Rand's parents, and Rand reacts as if he's speaking of the two rivers, right? And I'm going, you idiot. They said that, there's more to your lineage than is immediately clear. So I immediately read through that he is speaking of Rand's actual parentage and not speaking of his father in Two Rivers. And yet that seemed to have flown entirely over Rand's head, if I read that scene correctly. Yeah. My next note just simply says title of the book, ! So we got to the moment where they mentioned the eye of the world. Yep. And as I recall, it's that many people have sought the eye of the world, and that it is a goal. It is a place of seeming power or of importance. And then the section after that, which again feeds into this theme of mistrust of Moiraine, was a real emphasis on the fact that he is being used by the Tower and the Aes Sedai, that he is far from the first person who has been in this position. And every time there has been a hero in that position, he gets used by Aes Sedai, the tower, to complete their goals with total disregard for their safety and outcomes. And of course, that becomes a litany of names that I did not write down and don't remember, but specific examples, some of which he will go on and ask Tom about, as I recall, in the next chapter for clarification, like who was that guy and who was that? That is essentially my role on this podcast. Who was that guy? What was that?
Yeah, so just for anyone listening along, the names, I believe I got, if not all of them, most of them. Davian, Urian Stonebow, Guayer Amalsalon, Rowland Darksbane, and Logain.
And those are false. Well, Logain is a false dragon, and that's kind of confirmed in this dream that this is not actually who we should be worried about. It's a distraction from all of that. And so the emphasis then is that the light is always constricted and manipulated, whereas the dark is truly free. And that's the message he wants to leave Rand with, that if you want to experience real freedom and be outside of all that, then you have to listen to me and you have to follow me. So I just noted that Rand kind of immediately dismisses this dream, but it felt very real and seemed like he could be injured by it, and some of the threats were real. And then, as you already alluded to, we learned that the rats were actually affected at the beginning of the next chapter. Take over there. I have a little bit of riffing on the name Baalzamon, but you can first fill in whatever I should have said.
No, I mean, I think you got most of the really important things. I think the litany of names is really important. I think the implication, and specifically when he's talking about his parents, about Rand's parents, Baalzamon specifically says that basically his mother and father were chosen for the purposes of basically producing Rand, whose destiny is to die in the way that the White Tower has prescribed. And so that's a really interesting claim that I think we'll need to kind of interrogate as the series goes on and think about that. The other thing that I wanted to mention is towards the end of the dream, Rand starts to say what we had identified in a previous episode as what's sometimes called the catechism, right? It's like the Dark One is bound at Sheol Ghul along with the Forsaken and blah, 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 right? And he starts to say that. He says, "You are bound." And then Baalzamon interrupts him. And my original plan was to maybe read a decent chunk of what he said, but apparently it's almost a full page. So go back and check this out. He has what I wrote in my notes as the "I have never been bound" speech, where he says, "I've never been bound." A few things he says. He says, "I stood at Luz Theron Kinslayer's side while he did the deed that named him. It was I who told him to kill his wife and his children." He says, "1,000 years later, I sent the Trollocs ravening south, and for 3 centuries, they savaged the world." He said he whispered in Arthur Hawkwing's ear, "Then the length and breadth of the land Aes Sedai died." He lists a bunch of really important historical events, some of which we've had references to before and some of which he hasn't, and claimed all of that was his doing. And I think that's really interesting for 2 reasons, right? One is because it tells us something about how the Dark One operates, how the Dark One is trying to manipulate the world and get things in positions that he, sees as advantageous. But I think it's also really interesting that kind of the core belief of the world, the thing that, everyone kind of relies on to say the Dark One won't get us today, is that the Dark One was bound, right? The Dark One is captured. He's not able to get out. He can't touch the world. And what Baalzamon is claiming in this dream is no, not only is he not presently bound, he has never been bound. And all of the terrible things that have happened since the dragon originally 3,000 years ago have all been his fault. And that kind of direct level of influence of the world is something that literally everyone denies almost as a prayer arbitrarily when they're, just, warding off evil in their own lives. And I think that's really interesting to see him claiming you're all wrong.
Yeah, I was thinking as you spoke that so much of this chapter makes the light versus the dark feel very much like a chess match. But it's not quite that, because he describes the light as a chess player, right? Arranging the pieces, making sure everything is in position before they launch their strategy for their own ends and checkmate. But at the same time, as you're just describing there, he's expressing that like, yeah, but I don't play by any of those rules, right? So
Yeah.
I don't know the right metaphor. It's like, the kid who makes up what the chess pieces do on their own, and the pawns have a cool sword, so they just knock over whatever they want or what have you.
Yeah,
So
I feel like the version of the metaphor that immediately jumped into my mind is the light is playing a game of chess where their objective is checkmate, and the dark is playing a game of chess where their objective is to flip over the board. And those are two very different ways of playing that game.
yeah, and it actually, gosh, my pop culture references are always so lame, but I actually am somebody who enjoys the second Matrix movie. And sorry, oh, that face
Yeah,
showed me
this is
but
a
we're
non-visual
out.
medium. I should say I gave you a face when you said that.
But one of the things I love about the way that universe is constructed, at least until this newest Matrix movie, is that you have the kind of the guy who lives at the center of the matrix who says my whole job is to balance the equation, and that the oracle's whole job as a program is to unbalance the equation. So it feels like that as well, right?
Yeah.
Like I am bound by reason and logic, and this is what we have to do to maximize the output of these humans, and I just am not, right? I have no rules, and I'm going to unbalance it. So that reverses the light and dark somewhat in Matrix mythology, but I think that feels the spirit here. To your larger point, that really just shows that everybody's wrong. It makes me think again about like, well, where did they learn these things? Because the assumption is the wheel has spun, and so they're receiving this mythology, and yet they've received the wrong message at some point. Now, is that just the natural telephone game of generations, or is that actually something deliberate, something that somebody has purposely introduced into the mythology to make sure that there is no protection, or that the protection has a chink in the armor?
So I think that's absolutely right. The one thing that I will say is I find it very interesting that you are taking someone who is referred to by Rand as the father of lies at his word on all of this. I think it's definitely worth considering how much of what he's saying is true, in the same way that we've doubted Moraine throughout this, we've doubted Tom throughout this. I'd give the same level of skepticism to Baal-Zaman that we have everyone else. That being said, I think we're kind of running out of time on this chapter. So riff on Baal-Zaman before we talk about the next one.
Yeah, although I am going to just point out that that's the Star Wars fan in me, because the Sith always tell the truth and the Jedi always lie. So that's why I trust him more. The name stuck out to me immediately. I have some literary background on it, but I'd be lying if I didn't say the first thing that came to mind was me singing Baal-Zaman has a devil put aside for me, for me. And that, of course, is not actually Baal-Zaman, but it's Beelzebub, reminiscent here from it. But particularly the BA apostrophe AL actually invokes an earlier god, which is Baal. And I'm not the strongest on my biblical references, but as I understand it, Baal is a Canaanite Phoenician god, so an earlier god than the Hebrew god, and in the Bible is referenced frequently as one of the kind of pagan systems that is being replaced by Christianity first Judaism and then Christianity as time goes on. And I think fertility, rainstorms, but also kind of just general demons. And then that makes sense very much that as we move to Christianity, that becomes just a name for a general demon instead of necessarily there. Beelzebub in my favorite of the many epic poems in Western civilization is Milton's Paradise Lost, which begins with Satan has been expelled from heaven and fell all the way to hell, literally, and it wakes up on this burning sulfur plain, kind of given just an dude, like the worst hangover of all time. And Beelzebub is another rebellious angel, so an angel who was in heaven, rebelled against God, and was cast out by the Son and by God. But Satan turns first to Beelzebub and tells him all of the plans. So he's very much a lieutenant, right? Because Satan remains the kind of focal point of that half of the epic poem. But to think about Beelzebub as somebody who knows what's up, right, and understands the world while being a subordinate, not totally in control, to me became intriguing because, yeah, like you just alluded to, I kind of trusted whatever he was saying because he knows the plans. But that naturally would beg the question, then who is he reporting to, or who does what power does he speak to if not a literal person? So that's all I really have on it, other than singing more Queen to you. So we can leave it at that, or if you want to react to anything.
No, I think the only thing that I would add to that is just to recall from a few chapters ago when Moraine was telling the story of Manetheren and, you know, the final battle of that great kingdom. She talked about how there was someone at that battle who identified themselves as Baal-Zaman, but her take in that story was there is no way the person calling themselves Baal-Zaman when Manetheren was around could possibly be the Dark One, because if the Dark One had been there, Manetheren would have fallen in hours instead of weeks. And so it's interesting, we've got this conflicting story. Even in the Manetheren story, she says Baal-Zaman is one of the ancient names for the Dark One, but we've got this interesting contrast of, like, as you're saying, is Baal-Zaman the subordinate, or is it actually the Dark One himself? And that contrast, I think, is really interesting, especially given the literary kind of backing that this comes from. That being said, let's dive into chapter 15.
Wait, one just other tiny little thought. Moraine did mention, like, in one of their first conversations, she asked Rand if he'd been having dreams, right? And was specifically concerned about dreams. I just wanted to make sure I had that detail right.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. All right. Chapter 15. We go from Stag and Lion to Strangers and Friends. I've also just been watching the new season of Better Call Saul, and all of the episodes are structured like that, blank and blank. So this could be an episode of Better Call Saul. Anyway, walk us through this chapter.
Yes. So Rand wakes up. He makes his way downstairs, and he witnesses an argument between the cook at the inn and the owner, Master Finch. It soon becomes apparent that what they are arguing about is the large number of rats with broken backs who have appeared throughout the inn overnight, and that upsets the innkeeper because no one likes to find rats in their inn. But Rand obviously is very freaked out by this. He eventually goes and talks to Perrin, finds out that Perrin also had the same dream, is not feeling well enough to go outside as a result of it. And then once he leaves Perrin's room, he meets the young woman Min, who we briefly encountered in the previous chapter. And she is able to see visions around certain people, and she gives us a litany of visions around all of the individuals who we've met so far, and I'm sure we'll spend lots of time discussing all of those images. Once he has eventually chatted with Min, he makes his way out into the city of Baerlon, and there he has a few interesting encounters. First, he runs into Padden Fane, the peddler who everyone thought had been killed by the Trollocs. He offers to give Padden Fane an opportunity to come back to the Stag and Lion with them, or, you know, to get help from them, and he refuses and eventually runs away. At that point, Rand literally runs into Matt, finds out that Matt also has had the same dream, and that is when they have a run-in with the White Cloaks. So Matt decides that he is going to play a prank on them. He goes up on the roof and uses his sling to knock over some barrels, and it gets the White Cloaks dirty. And then Rand finds himself unable to contain himself from laughing at this situation. And the White Cloaks, specifically the leader of the group, Dane Bornhald, basically confront Rand about it, and it seems like it's going to go very poorly for Rand until suddenly the town watch shows up around the corner and the White Cloaks back off. At this point, Rand and Matt kind of regroup. They find Tom. They tell Tom what's been going on with their dreams, and Tom immediately basically tells them, don't tell Moraine anything about this. Don't tell anyone anything about this. We need to get back to the inn. We need to make sure that Perrin is not spilling the beans about this dream and what's going on. They make their way back to the inn, and when they they arrive, they find Perrin, who tells them that not only has he not told anyone, but there is a new arrival at the inn. It turns out that the wisdom Nynaeve has been following them along the road and is now currently talking to Moraine, which is a conversation we'll get into next week in the chapter The Wisdom. But before we try to do an entire episode ahead of the episode, in this chapter, was there anything in particular that stood out to you, moments that you thought were, effective or ineffective, either way? What jumped out at you in this chapter?
Yeah, so I would say the first part was kind of what I expected, and then it quickly became what I didn't expect. And so I really enjoyed Min and her arrival, and I want to unpack a little bit more of how she's described in some of the language there. But that was kind of, again, your character, your party is walking around the new town. Who do you meet? The next NPC that will get you through, right?
Yep.
Or party member, right? This is the friend who missed the first two sessions and is joining perhaps because they suddenly are in town or what have you. And then the peddler became a huge surprise. I was not expecting him to show back up and to appear again, and just seemed shifty as heck. It's funny. I keep in my head, I really want to curse, and I'm like, no, we can't get that explicit warning. So I'm coming off as like a gee willikers, aren't I a sucker? But yeah, he was shifty as F, as the kids say. And then that was I'll skip over that next portion just to go. That was doubly true when Nynaeve showed up at the end. I was just like, that was more of a like, what? Like, super suspicious that she's here, that she followed. We knew the ferry was destroyed. There should be serious questions about how she got here. And I had also thought of her very much as the big fish in a small pond. And so to see her out of that small pond, I both think she can do nothing or think we terribly like misjudged her in some way if she can do something as big as getting here and having an effect on the flow of this. So and I think I'll just wrap up by saying that's all a credit to Robert Jordan, that we laid that groundwork with these characters, and some of those characters have now disappeared, and so to bring some back around, nothing was tipped that would really happen with some and not others. I thought we were sticking with just this fellowship, so this was some real surprises.
Yeah, and I think this is a gift of Robert Jordan's. We haven't seen it too often so far, but for a series that I believe has over 1,000 named characters, it is remarkable how often characters who we met 4 books ago, or in this case 4 chapters ago, suddenly show up in places we didn't expect them, where it still makes pretty logical sense. And I think that's something that's really impressive, right? Is how often he's able to surprise us, despite the fact that we read a bunch of chapters where Nynaeve was the focus of discussion, right? We heard way too many things about her hitting old men in the head with her stick for her not to be a somewhat important character, and yet we're still shocked when she shows up. I think that's impressive. A couple things I wanted to pull out from the early section of this chapter. First off, we do see a quick scene where Tom is telling a story in the common room of the inn, and I just think we get one quick section of that story that I think is important, especially if you know the name of the second book. He tells the story at the end of it. He says, and I think this is a either direct quote or very close to, the great hunt for the horn of Valir that will summon heroes of ages back from the grave to battle for the light. And that's just a cool kind of myth piece of world building. And given that book 2 of the series, sorry for the spoilers, Greg, is called The Great Hunt, that's something that I think we can, pretty easily, pull out on. I don't have too much else to say about it. Just that's a phrase and a sentence that I think is really useful for world building and something that's worth noting. Anything to say about Tom's story? I don't think it was a big thing. I just wanted to make sure that phrase got in, the listeners' minds.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. Didn't bump much on it. It seemed like he was just taking the opportunity to make a few coin while they're paused and, doing what he does. And as the book has progressed, he's been seen more as kind of a repository of knowledge and lore, perhaps better suited term for it. So seeing him perform again was like, Oh, right. That's what he does, and that's why he's a traveler as he would. And a reminder about the cloak tips people off and things like that as well. So yeah. And the other thing I will pull out of that early section, it's actually before that, was just, I think we've covered the rats and how that is kind of noting that this might be more than just a dream. But I really like just the reaction of the two. Perrin is so troubled he's gonna stay in bed and like hide for the day.
Yeah.
And Matt's just like, yeah, shrug. Time to go see the city. Which again, matches that kind of rube we saw at the beginning of last chapter. That's like, oh, portentous symbolic threats. Nah, I want to go check this out, see if there's any cool food to eat or what have you.
And I think this is why I like Perrin more than I like Matt. If you give me an option between walking around somewhere and staying in bed, I'm kind of going to be staying in bed. That is not at all a good transition, but I think this is a good place then to kind of move on to the next part of the chapter. Let's talk about Min and the many visions that we get. I think to me, this is the densest section of this chapter, just because it's like image after image after image. And so given that, I'm curious whether there was anything that, stood out to you or that you pulled out in particular from all of the kind of many different things that Min is saying. She kind of gives us what almost is a very mysterious monologue, and then Rand runs away before we can get any clarifying questions asked.
Yeah. I liked Min a lot. This language that I believe she says Moraine has said of her is that she sees pieces of the pattern.
Yeah.
And it reminded me when we talked about Melville's loom and that being kind of a model of the cosmos, right? A loom, when it's weaving, creates a pattern. And here we have a character who can identify these flashes of different moments in the pattern, but can't from those pieces really assemble the whole. So when she then, as you noted, gives us a laundry list of different visions, to me, that was just like, okay, here's what you're going to see in the next 3 books or whatever. And not that I would really have committed those enough to memory to be sure of it, but I imagine if I wrote those each down, I could use that as a checklist moving forward and see eventually. I would imagine we get all of them. So in my book, that starts on 253. That's probably irrelevant to the listeners, but just so I cite it properly. So maybe I'll just read a bit of that. About what she says, and then you can pick out whatever ones are useful. So Rand says, what do you see when you look at the rest of us? All sorts of things, Min said with a grin, as if she knew what he really wanted to ask. The war. Master Andra has 7 ruined towers around his head, and a babe in a cradle holding a sword. And she shook her head. Men like him, you understand, always have so many images. They crowd one another. The strongest images around the Gleeman are a man, not him, juggling fire in the White Tower. And that doesn't make any sense at all for a man. The strongest thing I see about the big curly-haired fellow are a wolf and a broken crown and trees flowering all around him. And the other one, a red eagle, an eye on a balance scale, a dagger with a ruby, a horn, and a laughing face. There are other things, but you see what I mean. This time I can't make up or down of any of it. She waited, then still grinning, until he finally cleared his throat and asked. So maybe we'll pause there, because that's a lot already. Like you said, it's very dense. So that is the Gleeman, and then the curly-haired one would be
Perrin,
and then the red. No, sorry, the other one. He's Matt. Okay,
is Matt. Yeah.
Okay. And I mean, especially those are just, I mean, those could be the chapter images, right? They're just symbols. They're just flashes. And
a couple of them are.
Okay, nice. And so we're not going to, I'm sure, know what those mean for some time to come, but it feels like the kind of thing where a movie builds to that moment, and then you just see the camera lingers on the red eagle or the ruby or what have you, and you're supposed to, as the audience, go like, oh, or I guess do the Leonardo DiCaprio meme, pointing at the screen. Yeah.
I mean, I think For me, what this section does is it gives us a lot of really interesting imagery to be keeping in mind. As you say, right? It's the same thing where, something pops up and you are immediately keying in on it. This is basically, I think, Robert Jordan's way of saying, here are 15 things that when you hear this phrase, it matters. And I think in a series this big and dense, I think that's really important to almost just have just signposts of, if you are reading a chapter about Tom, pay attention to the White Tower or people juggling fire, right? If you're reading about Perrin and there's any mention of a broken crown, like dive in on that image. And so to me, this is almost like Min is giving us the cliff notes in advance, right? We've still got to read the book, but at least we know what parts to be pulling out. We know, kind of what symbolism to be leaning into. Is there anything, okay, we need to do at least one more dumb predictions moment. Give me one of those 15 images. What do you think it means?
So one thing I will pull from all that is it strikes me that there doesn't seem to be a lot of overlap, right? When she describes each, they seem very separate. And, I could go on to read the similar list from Rand. And, back to what you said, Rand leaves immediately, and as readers it's like, no, wait, ask some follow-up questions. But you also realize he cuts her off because it's what do these things mean out of context? Right? His being a sword that isn't a sword, a golden crown of laurel leaves, a beggar's staff, you pouring water on sand, and on and yeah, that doesn't mean anything to them. Gosh, so to pull out a few, I really like an eye on a balance scale. To me, that feels important in the duality in the binary. It could be simply accounting for how the battle is going between the two sides, trying to measure who is balancing, which way the balance is tipping at a general moment. Or it strikes me also as, he is determining which way to go himself, right? He comes to a moment of choice. And so he's balancing out the two sides to see, it's a pro and con list, right? If I go to the light, this, if I go to the dark, that. So that all is really intriguing to me. I don't want to pick another one from, that was from Matt. Yes. Then, right. That was a Matt. Jumping over to Rand. A sword that isn't a sword. Intriguing, especially there's references to the Heron sword, both here with Min and then later with the light cloaks. So my mind went to that. I think there's some, it seems like that is a sword. So, that language isn't quite like a sword and something more or something like that. So it's probably something a little different than that. I do like pouring water on sand, right? Making mud. But what is that? And what does that mean? Sand is kind of a more stable form in some ways. That's debatable, I guess, but water, removing sand or changing sand dramatically, is that a wiping away of a tower, a washing away of a society or a tower or a way of life? Again, you get a little into Nostradamus territory, right? What could that possibly mean? So yes. Okay. Clip that audio, put it in your magic vault, and tell me how I need the Price is Right sound effect when they come up again.
I think the only other thing I wanted to mention, other than just the litany of imagery that Min gives us, is kind of the end of that conversation. So first off, I think the reason why Rand runs away so much is because the images that she is giving Rand keep getting progressively darker, to the point that the last two images that she sees around him are three women standing over a funeral. Is it beer? I never know how to pronounce that word.
Okay. I always say beer, but I'm not even sure.
Yeah. That with him on it. And then the next image is a black rock wet with blood. And so if I was Rand and someone was telling me, oh yeah, you're going to die and three women are going to be standing around you, that's kind of rough. And then as he's starting to extricate himself from the conversation, she says something really interesting to me that kind of raises some flags and is worth digging into. She starts by saying, if I told you everything I saw, it would like curl your hair like parents or something like that. And then I forget exactly the context, but the phrase she uses when describing whatever she sees in her own future or his future is, maybe it's your idea of a dream, but I never thought it was mine. And I think that's really interesting that Min seems to be seeing something about herself around Rand, especially because she says that they're definitely going to meet again. And so I think that's, just a little hint at something that otherwise we wouldn't have gotten. We're not just getting images for all of our main characters, oddly, except for Egwene, but we're also getting some information about Min herself that she's kind of offhandedly revealing. Any last thoughts on Min before we dig into the second half of the chapter?
No, emphasis again on, I like this idea of pieces of the pattern. And then what are we getting in those dreams, but pieces of a pattern, right? And even on a larger scale, right? When Baal Zaman connects to these historical moments, it's like expanding outward on that. And so that phrase you just said of, I wouldn't consider it a dream, is that, there's a play on that where it's like, oh, because it's not a happy dream. So I wouldn't call it a dream, but also I wouldn't call my visions dreams. I would call them pieces of a pattern. And so I think it feels to me like a little wordplay there to make both of those meanings true. She liked her a lot, looking for more. And, I think I said when we talked about my dislike of dreams, prophecy is often right after that because it feels a little too clever sometimes. And I'm not saying here, but in general, when somebody's like, do you remember that I said on page 7, the thing that happened on, the penultimate page of the novel? And it's like, yeah, of course you can do that. You made the whole thing up. Right. And so, it's interesting to me when it is not the focal point, when it's just something that's part of the journey. And so I'm more patient here. And thinking of the next big piece probably would be, when they get involved with the Children of the Light. And this again seemed just like a total kind of fool move on the part of Matt, like, let me just cause trouble. And we were saying at the beginning of the last chapter that it felt like a powder keg, and it's like, oh yeah, let's just play with matches right next to it and see what happens and move forward there. What I liked about Matt in this moment is the title of the chapter is Strangers and Friends, which plays on all that we're meeting, but then Matt is like a stranger friend, right? Yeah. Like he's acting bizarrely, he's not meeting expectations, and I guess I skipped over the peddler a little bit there as well, but he's also a friend acting stranger, right? Like he's behaving suspiciously. The details of how he left that last town, Two Rivers, is left skeptical, or is left vague in a way that is like, okay, buddy. So I think all of that kind of just mixes in here to say the characters and the world are both changing, and it's really going to get murky as things continue. And you said in your summary, the town authorities appear, and it is often felt like the town is a lower level than the kind of Aes Sedai and these larger forces. But here it was quite clear that the town is the dominant, and they're going to leave as a part of that. So, man, that's like 50 things. So bounce off whatever in there you are interested in.
Yeah. So as far as Matt's characterization, when you were talking about Matt and kind of how, he's acting very impulsively and kind of, like you say, really adding fire to this powder keg, it really reminded me actually of a line from The Good Place. I don't know why I keep bringing up that show when we're talking about this, but I feel like Matt, at least in this early section, reminds me a lot of like smarter Jason Mendoza. And there's a scene where Jason is talking to Michael, and Michael is like, well, you need to be cautious. And Jason is like, wait, you mean having an idea isn't a reason to do something? And that's kind of how I feel about Matt in this section, right? Is he's like, oh, I see some white cloaks, I see some mud, let's do it. There's nothing else to the way he's processing this. And that's kind of Matt, right? So far, what we know about Matt is like, he likes to get into trouble. He put some flour on some dogs, and he doesn't think before he acts. And that's kind of our list. So
Yeah.
that just impulsiveness feels, and it feels on brand for an 18-year-old, right? We've all met those teenagers who were like, okay, you need a few more years, right? We both
Yeah.
teach college students, and sometimes 18-year-olds act like they're 15. And I think that's kind of Matt.
Yeah, and it's funny, and maybe it is because I teach students like that too often. Like I find it not endearing at all. Whereas, I'm not sure exactly how it's supposed to play, but I'm just annoyed by him more than anything. It's like, dude, come on, play it cool. And I have friends who act like that all the time when you're like it's almost like we're in public, right? Like
Yeah.
we're not in your basement joking around. We all went to a restaurant tonight, so maybe don't shout, swears or whatever. Like, yeah, it's a little bit like that, like the friend who can't quite read the room as a part of that. Um Interesting to me, again, I referenced it earlier that the heron mark comes up in that conversation and they
Yeah.
note the sword, and that means something it means more to the light cloaks than it does to Rand. Rand
Yeah.
still doesn't understand, but we're seeing that means more and more in this larger world.
Yeah, and I think for me, what this interaction with the White Cloaks does is it really highlights how much Matt and Rand don't know about the world, right? This is their first kind of trip out into a city outside of the two rivers, and immediately what they do is, they're just ruining the situation, right? Matt is immediately messing with exactly the opposite people who you want to be messing with. Rand is laughing at people who will probably kill you for laughing at them. And just the fact that they are so fish out of water in this scene, don't even know all of the mistakes they're making, I think really highlights to me just how 18-year-old on a school trip these characters still are sometimes. And that can be really frustrating, but I think it also kind of rings true. And for me, Matt is one of those characters who in this book, I don't enjoy Matt. I have the same reaction you do. I'm like, he's just kind of childish and impulsive and not doing much. But as is often the case with stories about teenagers, as they grow up, I grow to like Matt a whole lot more. So give him a chance. It might be a few books.
Yeah, and I mean to that point, I was just gonna say like, what is to be a good story, you have to have dynamic characters, and they have to grow and change, and so the starting point can be frustrated, and we are still not at the halfway point of this very thick novel in a series of very thick novels. So I think it certainly makes sense to me that this is the starting place. Something that's been happening increasingly across different fandoms is, and I saw somebody recently blame the binge model of streaming on this, and I think that might be a good thesis statement or a good hypothesis, perhaps. But people are totally impatient, right? Like
Yeah.
we just wrapped up the Kenobi TV show, which my identity was deeply involved with. And people were like pissed off at episode 2. They're like, we haven't, like, why don't we know where this is going yet? And it's like, because there's 6 episodes, right? Like, oh, I don't like this, it doesn't make sense based on where these characters should end up. It's like, because it's not over. Right.
Yeah.
And so there's been a lot of that lately in a lot of fandoms, not just Star Wars, though that's always what comes most easily to mind. And I think having patience to let a storyteller tell you the story they want to tell is so much more convincing. Actually, my friend Colby used this phrase on his show, which I've heard a couple times lately, and I don't know the origins of. But his phrase was, "I'm on the roller coaster to ride the roller coaster, not drive the roller coaster."
Yeah.
And I think modern fandoms have kind of lost sight of that. They're like, "Give me what I want now," forgetting that like the whole point of a good story is to be involved with the story that wants to be told. And while I think fandom is largely to blame for that, these companies react to them, right?
Yeah.
We get a product in so many of these fandoms that's like, you said you like this, then here's this. Yes, so while all of that kind of post dates Wheel of Time, or is maybe something going on with people who are just streaming the show, I think it is a good reminder that the point of a story is to savor the journey and to take your time with it. And and what better way than podcasting about it with a good friend? So
Yeah, and my version of I don't want to drive the roller coaster has always been like, if I wanted to be a writer, I would have had to be a lot better at creative writing, right? You don't want
Mm.
me writing your Star Wars scripts. It would make for really bad TV shows. And I feel the same way about this. I want Robert Jordan to be telling the story because he's a better storyteller than I am.
Yeah, anytime a fan takes over, it just becomes derivative.
Yeah.
Like, do you remember that old thing you like? Here's a new thing just like it. And I think, why I imagine this book series stands apart so much in the world of fantasy and has such a devoted fan base has to be because it does something truly magnificent and truly rewarding. So I'd rather follow that ride. So my only other notes, I mean, as you alluded to in your summary, Nynaeve comes back and is really just kind of the cliffhanger to tune in next week for the next chapter to see what's going on. But definitely if I was a cat, all the hairs on my back stood up. It's like, nope, this isn't right. I don't trust her at all. So if we're keeping track, I trust the Dark Lord of Lies. I do not trust the woman. So maybe I need to go to some sensitivity training in the
Yeah,
intervening
I think you might be a white cloak. We need to be a little
yeah.
bit worried about this. Um, yeah, I think we've covered all of the major topics that I had for this chapter. And I'm really looking forward to. I think I mentioned this before we started recording today. For my money, the first half of this book is really solid setup, and the second half of this book is wonderful. And we're just about to get to the section where I'm really excited to be podcasting about. So stick around; it's only going to get better as we go. Before we close for the day, any last thoughts, Greg?
Sure. Just a little bit of podcast business. So next week we will be reading chapters 16 and 17. That would be the Wisdom and Watchers and Hunters, another blank and blank chapter, as it were. And so that again rounds out to about 30 pages. So we hope this pace is working for everybody. And we're still in the summer months, so we're hoping you're taking your paperbacks or your earbuds to the beach or somewhere exciting and lovely to do that with. And as I alluded to, we are now recording in the future of you all, but are getting our initial reactions. And I just want to send a shout out and thank you to Kyle Scully, to Director Bennick, and to Wampa's Lair. These are 3 Twitter accounts that have really helped us spread the word and shared this. We got a great shout out from Coffee with Kenobi, which is one of the biggest Star Wars podcasts out there. So that was a thrill and really exciting. And then we have lots of personal friends, my friend Catherine, our shared friend Lindsay, and the list could go on and on, but we're hearing that people are starting to listen. We hope you're enjoying it. And if you've gotten to this episode, why not throw it on your social media and give a shout out just to help us grow this community a little bit more. I mean, come on, you got to chapters 14 and 15. You must want other people to read and talk about this with. So I will leave the rest of the podcast business to our usual outro, but wanted to make sure we didn't get past some shout outs to some people who have been helpful already. Thank you so much. We're really grateful. Even if you're just somebody listening to this, Tylor was stoked earlier this week to see that there were international listeners. I believe we had an Israel and we had...
There was a Peru and some Canada, and I count Canada as international. I don't care what anyone else says.
Amazing. So if that's you and you stuck with us as far as this episode, definitely throw us a tweet or an email. All the details to follow. But Tylor, it's been a pleasure as always. I will plan to see you next week. Anything you want to add?
No, I thought that was going to be the perfect intro of everyone. We're really psyched that you've been listening. We're so thrilled to have you along, and we will see you next week through the glass columns.
So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend this show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.